Hi, everyone. I hope this message finds each of you so very well. I'm speaking to you from my studio in West Orange, New Jersey, and I could not be more delighted to once again have the pleasure of interviewing the remarkable Dr. Karen Frances McCarthy, who is an award-holding medium, a renowned spiritualist, and a best-selling author. As Karen generously shares her profound wisdom with us today, she will be bringing the mission of Grief and Rebirth podcast to life, educating, enlightening, and empowering us to make meaningful choices on the path to healing. Karen honed her high-level skills in mediumship, healing, and public speaking at the prestigious Arthur Findlay College in the UK. She also holds a diploma in bereavement counseling, which allows her to guide people through grief with care and deep understanding. And through her private practice in Dublin and New York, she helps clients worldwide on their journeys toward healing and greater spiritual awareness. Her two thought-provoking books, titled The Other Irish and her deeply moving best-selling memoir, Till Death Don't Us Part, resonate with readers across the globe. Till Death Don't Us Part speaks to Karen's extraordinary journey from skepticism to the undeniable reality that her deceased fiancé was communicating with her from the other side. And in addition to her impressive mediumship and writing, Karen recently completed groundbreaking doctoral research on contemporary ghost literature, examining how ghost stories affect us emotionally and how they connect to the larger questions about life, death, and the mysteries beyond. For this pioneering work, she earned a PhD from the University of Birmingham, one of the world's top-ranked research institutions. As a dedicated educator, Karen has shared her wisdom through esteemed institutions such as the Shift Network, the Edgar Cayce Center, and the Arthur Conan Doyle Center. Soon, she will be leading a fascinating new course on the American ghost story at New York University. I'm looking forward to speaking with Karen, who's joining us from New York City to discuss spirituality, empathy, mediumship, and consciousness. Look into the cultural shift away from traditional religious teachings towards a deeply personal spirituality and more for a fascinating, enlightening, and unforgettable conversation you will not want to miss. Hi there, and welcome to the Grief and Rebirth podcast. I'm your host, author and trauma survivor Irene Weinberg, here to encourage you wherever you are in your healing journey. In each episode, I chat with incredible grief and trauma specialists, healers, mediums, and celebs, as well as remarkable people who have inspiring healing stories to share. If you're looking for a podcast that's both uplifting and inspiring, you've found it. Let us help you find your joy in life. Hey, Karen, a heartfelt welcome back to Grief and Rebirth podcast. It's so nice to see you.
It's lovely to be here.
Truly a pleasure. So nice to be with you again. So let's start by because a lot of people don't know, you're so amazing to me with all that you've accomplished and all of who you are, but you have a very unique journey from war correspondent to a spiritualist medium. And then your fiance transitioned, and then you learned a lot even about the afterlife. So can you tell us your story about how you got to where you are?
It's a bit of a long story, but I'll shorten it. So I was very much, grew up in Ireland, raised Catholic. By the time I was 17, I'd had my fill of it and abandoned all forms. I became very much, I ended up in university. I did my bachelor's, my master's. You sort of become at that age not interested in any of this. You just become more interested in music and art and whatever and other things. And so I sort of became very much a skeptic. I really had no interest in anything spiritual, anything religious whatsoever. And sort of lived pretty much like that. I did start practicing Zen at one point, but then Zen is non-theistic, so it was the only thing that I could really the focus was on Dharma teaching and meditation. It was anything I could really get my head around. But, and I was a journalist, I was a writer. My first book that you mentioned was part of the Northern Ireland Peace Process. I was a war correspondent in Iraq. I used to cover politics and so. And then my fiance died very suddenly, very young, one afternoon in New York City. And I was actually down south doing some research for my first book, which was political, when I used to do politics. And what started happening, and I talked about this in this book, the second book, which is Till Death Don't Us Part, which you and I have talked about before.
Right.
I kind of put the story together in that, of how I was really kind of forced by him and the powers that be into sort of being really knocked out of this sort of smug skepticism that I had been living in, to recognize that something else was happening. And it was really because electronics started turning on, furniture started moving, things were I was at all sorts of mad things that I talked about until Death Don't Us Part started happening. Now, having said that, that used to happen when I was a child. And
That's interesting.
Yeah, I had things, so by the time up until I was about 12, 13, which is kind of common, it happens to quite a lot of children. And, of course, I get into 40, you get into your teens. That's it, just not into.
Did your parents know that you were having these?
Yeah, I would, as a very small child, as a toddler, would have conversations with thin air and scared the bejesus out of my mother, And she would say, "Who are you talking to?" And I would name some long dead relative that, as a 2-year-old, I had never met, or a 3-year-old. So, but my mother was Catholic. She put no stock in it, and really, by the time I hit my teens, you're interested in boys and fashion and music.
Right. It's not cool. It's not cool.
Yeah, totally. So I just lost interest and it just went away. And so, but then years later, once I hit 40, when my partner died, everything changed. So I really got knocked out of, as I said, smug skepticism was really, I always find it's very easy to be a skeptic. I got knocked out of that and was forced to have to, I used to, as a child, wake up and see total strangers standing at the end of the bed, sort of thing, My friend's kid, happens to him now as well. But this all sort of came back in force, and it just became an old everyday thing, and it
just resurfaced.
Well, all of these events just sort of, all of these events just started relentlessly, happening all the time. It was multiple times a day. And my first thought, as, any skeptic will tell you, it was that I must be gone out of my mind with grief. That I'm imagining all this stuff. I'd be lying on the bed in the afternoon, I would see these little imprints, like there was a little cat or something, invisible cat, walking from the end of the bed up to me, and I would see all these little imprints, and I would just sit there staring at them. What the hell is going on? Things, electronics that weren't even plugged in would turn on, and all sorts of mad things. And I was really kind of, like I said, sort of shaken out of my complacency, and in the search for answers, because like I said, the first thing is this, I must be having some kind of breakdown. But it didn't feel like a breakdown. I was still writing, I was still interviewing, I was still whatever. But I thought this must be how grief is manifesting. And, but it just became, because a lot of the stuff was physical, it wasn't in my head, a lot of the stuff was physical, like in the world, that, I was like, no, this is, I didn't just turn on that GPS, and I did not just turn on that lamp, and I did not just shake this bed, and all sorts of things. Because it was very much external, it couldn't have been. And I really had to come around to, there's something else going on here. And funnily enough, the first person I bumped into, which I talk about in my book, so I won't labour it here, was a Catholic priest. And he was the one who said, no, this happens, it's our loved ones leave us signs. And that was like, what? And so then I happened to be in Virginia at the time. And then I didn't want to come back to New York. I just couldn't face coming back to New York after he died. So I stayed in Virginia, and I just went from, sort of was just led from place to place to place to the Edgar Casey Center was right there. The Norfolk Spiritualist Church was right there. The Monroe Institute was right there. I've said often before, you've heard me say, it was like the Area 51 of the afterlife right there where I was at the time, And so it just became this journey of like discovery of place. The University of Virginia's School of Perceptual Studies is right there. So there was an awful lot going on.
Wow. Yep.
A lot going on there. And so I just kind of was going from place to place, and it just became, and I won't give it away, but there was that epiphany, that one awakening moment where all of it just kind of converged into that, aha, this is you. I won't give it away in case anyone wants to read the book, but it's the end of the end of the second.
All right, so listen, everyone, it's called Till Death Don't Us Part.
Yeah, this book.
Here you go.
Yeah, so I don't want to ruin it in case anybody wants to read it, but just I had this epiphany one day where it was just like, and then the penny dropped, and then there was no going back after that. I'm sure you know lots of people have had that. Once you have an epiphany, that sort of ineffable sense of just knowing something on a very, very, very deep level that no amount of rationality or skepticism could explain. You just know it deep within you. There's no way to really describe the experience. There's also no way to go back to the person you were before.
Well, it's sort of what happened to me in the car accident.
Yeah, happens.
It
Yeah,
totally changed my whole perception of everything. I was a skeptic also, and I was like, boom.
And it really does fundamentally change you, because you just can't. It changes you on such a deep, sort of cellular, molecular level, or such a neural level that there's just no way to go back to the way you were. And that just changes everything, because then, you become so different that old friends just go, you've lost your marbles, and they kind of just, there's a big falling away of, it's like there's waves, a big falling away of friends, and then there's just this new wave of new people come in. So it was absolutely life-changing. Never went back to politics again after that. I just became much more interested in, and because what started happening there was, it wasn't just the furniture moving. What started happening was, once I accepted that the people at the end of the bed when I was a kid I kind of knew when I was a kid, I knew they weren't people. I knew they were spirits. It felt very normal to me as a child. It became very normal to me again at that point. And once that happened, and kind of all of the baggage of all of the rest of it, the skepticism went out the window, what started happening was I became very much aware of actual individuals and very detailed information about individuals belonging to somebody I was sitting with or whatever. Yes. And was encouraged. I mean, there are some early stories, what happened about that in the book as well. Just people, who would just sort of, I would sit down with somebody and somebody would show up who had died by suicide the year before, and I was able to sort of explain, they're wearing this, they're doing this, here's all these details about them to prove that it was them and they were okay. This started to happen a number of times. And so a couple of people...
When did you go, excuse me, just to interject, when did you start your mediumship training? So all of this happened, you were a skeptic. After that.
After this.
So you were getting all these messages, the ability was there, and then you went to refine it.
Well, no, all of this started happening, and it was coming up, and people like the Edgar Casey Center, for example, who had witnessed this, what was happening, people started encouraging me to go do something about it, to use something with it. And I was not in the least bit interested, because I was like, that's not who, I'm a war correspondent, political correspondent, that's not who I am. It was just too far from my own identity of who I was, but it kept happening. And so eventually a good friend of mine, Peter Goldbeck at the Edgar Casey Center, saw this happen one night in a big healing circle, and he was just like, that is some work you're doing. You really need to do something with it. So that took a lot of soul searching, because I didn't want to step into people's grief, and so I thought, well, if I'm going to do it, then I need to know what I'm doing, and I need to do this well, and I need to have it vetted, and, by people who really know what they're doing. And so I found my way eventually into the SNU and the Arthur Findlay College in England, and then actually went through the formal training, the formal education, and the formal assessments where other veteran mediums are linking in with you to be able to verify that you are actually saying and doing and getting what you claim to be getting. That was very important for me, was to have this vetted and validated and properly understood and properly trained, because I had actually been on the receiving end. I'm sure many of your listeners have experienced this. I had actually, in those early days when I was just coming to terms with what was going on, had actually seen some mediums and had been to some spiritualist churches. And I can honestly say there are so many people who are, and as you know, I'm a huge proponent of education. A lot of mediums who had who just had the ability but no actual education, were perpetuating an awful lot of very harmful superstitions. And I've seen this recur, and it happens all the time. I mean, I had somebody whose son died by suicide who came to me, had been to a medium, who told this poor mother that her son was earthbound. In other words, he couldn't go into the light, whatever. That's another medieval load of nonsense, but because he died by suicide. And I was like, even if you believed that, why would you say it? So to me,
that's cruel to say that. You're right.
Very ignorant. An awful lot of superstition. A lot of people can't get out of their own way, which is why I'm a huge, as you know, proponent of education. Which is why I did the awards, which I did my training. You know, I'm a huge proponent of education and mediumship, but also education. And we're going to talk about this later because I designed a course around this for people, which we'll talk about later.
Right.
It's very, very, very important. A lot of the myths and misconceptions that are shared have been dragged through history from Dante, from Homer, from the Protestant the Reformation, the 1500s, from these are just ancient beliefs. A lot of them came from fiction. I mean, Homer and Dante's fiction. A lot of them came from old Orthodox religious views, and they get perpetuated. They're like the old, you you throw a pillowcase of feathers out, and after months they're all covered in dirt and they're unrecognizable. All of these beliefs are like feathers that have been just thrown into the planet everywhere, and people are perpetuating superstitions arising from fiction, from medieval or classical fiction that isn't actually even true, or from belief systems or, certain belief systems. But if there was one single correct belief system, we would all have single religion. There would only be one religion. And so I feel, and I felt at the time, and this is why I really needed to take this very seriously, that having the ability is not enough. You have to be educated so that you do no harm. And so this was why, to answer your question, why I decided if I'm going to do this, I'm going to do it properly, and I'm going to do it well, and I'm going to know what I'm doing over and above the messages. Everybody can get a message from the spirit world, but how you sit in front of people and meet them in their grief is a different thing altogether.
And they get a big package when they talk with you because you have all this experience in healing grief, and you're a coach in a way, you're a medium, you've gotten your education, you've even written your dissertation, which I want to get to next.
Yeah.
Because in your dissertation, you blended academic scholarship with personal spiritual practice as a medium and teacher.
Yeah.
So how did these personal experiences shape your approach to the concepts of consciousness and the afterlife? And if you don't mind, could you give everybody a little encapsulated definition of what is consciousness? I know what it is, but a lot of people say they're talking about consciousness. What are they talking about?
Well, I think the way I'm using it is just the sort of single stream of consciousness. There's all sorts of ways different disciplines use that term consciousness. I'm using it in the way of consciousness studies. So the sort of new theories of consciousness, the new research into consciousness that, say, David Chalmers or Bertrand Sheldrake or Dean Radin, a lot of these academics themselves, scientists, physicists, psychologists are looking at it to understand really what the Buddhists have always understood, which is that there is a single interconnected stream of consciousness and we're all arising from it. There is one aspect of that I actually do really like, and that is that we are all still this is how mediumship works. This is how intuition works. This is how that gut feeling people think they have. It's intuition. How does that work? Or how do we do this on a daily basis, meet people and pick things up from people without even knowing we're doing it. How is that happening? And it's because we are all connected within a stream of consciousness. And, the sort of way I've heard it explained from some consciousness theorists is that the brain, as opposed to consciousness arising from the brain is an antenna that tunes in an aspect of consciousness from the stream that we're all part of. So it's almost like, think of it like the knob on a radio. There is the wavelength of the of the station that's broadcasting whatever is being broadcasted from the radio. That's there whether you've got a radio or not, right? And then you get yourself a little radio, a little brain, and then you turn the knob and you tune in a little bit of the frequency of all of the waves that are floating around. So to me, that's the easiest way to understand consciousness. What it also implies then is that we are all still in that stream. So we think, because we're in these little bodies, that we are separate from the stream, which is where a lot of this nonsense about earthbound spirits and going into the light comes from, because it implies that there is some geography involved, that we're here in our little bodies and they're there in something else. But if we start to understand that we are all in, that there is only the stream, and what arises out of this is perception, what arises out is the little antenna that we are, that's tuning in the part of us that is part of that stream of consciousness. I hope that's not too heady, but I think it's important to recognize that, because I think just in that, in and of itself, eliminates huge amount of superstition about getting lost, about the earthbound people and the lost people and the people not in the light. It's like, how can you not be in the light? You are already in the light.
Yes. And well, I'm glad you're doing this, because you're dispelling notions that people probably have. People who are listening to this podcast probably have some of these notions and going, oh my, that's really not true. There's, we're coming into more enlightenment with these kinds of discussions and interviews and all. And it's a wonderful way to educate people, because we are all part of the collective. Mm-hmm. We're all part of that stream. But some people feel they're more part of it than others, and it's not true. Anyone
make any sense? Yeah,
it makes no sense. So tell me, what inspired you to write this dissertation titled "The Re-Enchanted Ghost: Spectral Literature in 21st Century America," which delves into modern America's fiction's transformative take on spirituality, consciousness. That's a lot to say, Karen. So what inspires you to write it?
Yeah, I mean, as a doctorate, they're, not easy things to do. I was thinking about, it's a long time since I did my master's, and then, so much stuff changed, as I said.
Your master's was in what? In which modality?
In literature, Anglo-Irish literature.
Okay.
Many years ago, in my 20s. And then, I was kind of thinking, when all of this started happening, and I went to college, and I've got 3 certificates of recognition from the college, and I did all that study and assessment and all the rest of it. I was kind of like, what shall I do now? And so I kind of mulled this over for a while. I wrote the book before the PhD, and I wrote this book, Till Death Don't. Well, I'd written the other Irish, the Peace Process book a long time ago, before my partner died. I was actually writing it when he died. But the second book, Till Death Don't Us Part, is this after the Epiphany. And after I'd written that, I was thinking, now what shall I do? I've done my awards, I've done my training, I've done my assessments, I've written this book, and I was thinking about it, so I was kind of got interested in sacred texts and religion stuff. But the doctorate's such a humongous undertaking that I thought I should stick to my field, which was literature, rather than try to develop a whole new discipline and have to kind of start from scratch. So I just thought that the obvious thing to do seemed to be to look at ghost stories,
Which was fun and had to do with a lot of literature for you.
Well, yeah, I ended up, the thing with the PhD, anyone doing a PhD, the first year you're just reading stuff randomly all over the place. You've no idea what you're doing, and the sort of things, naturally, the thesis starts to arise out of that. What I started to notice in American literature in particular was a number of novels that were approaching the ghost. The genre of the ghost story has always arisen to mirror what's going on in our society, right? So Scrooge, like A Christmas Carol, for example, that arose out of the Industrial Revolution, right? This is the disparity between poverty. That could not have emerged at any other time. It came, so this is what you can safely say, that if you look at any ghost story from any era, it's going to tell you what was going on in that era.
Oh, that's so interesting.
People start writing ghost stories about it. But the ghost has generally been treated to circle back around to our myth and superstition, as some spirit at unrest, or some evil, or haunting, or
used to evoke fear.
Yes, or it's out there to sort of avenge itself, or get revenge, or amends, or all these sorts of things. The bottom line is the ghost is always lingering around somewhere it shouldn't be, should have moved on into wherever this move on is, this myth of the move on. And all of these ghost stories are really set on the planet amongst humans, and the ghost is this sort of secondary character. That's the typical ghost story, with the exception of, there was one book, his name's gone out of my head now, it was written in the 70s, gone out of my head, it'll come back to me. But this is, they're generally, at least in Western culture, set on the planet. Ghost is some weird thing that shouldn't be here at all, and it is, right? It's intrusive.
I mean, I'm thinking about, as you're saying all this, I'm thinking of one exception that I can think of, which would be that I wasn't in a cartoon Casper the Friendly Ghost.
Well, I wouldn't know. I don't know that I classify Casper as literature, but yes, Casper.
He's not literature, but I'm saying that the concept.
It's a children's thing. But I'm talking about culture and literature, and what I noticed was there was certain strands of ghosts in the ghost genre in American literature. Now, there's some great, which I won't go into, but there's some great literary innovations. So anybody who's interested in literature, there's really some great experimentation going on in terms of literature and fiction in the ghost genre. But what I started noticing was that there was a certain sort of body of work that was starting to arise sort of independently in American ghost literature, where it was all set in the afterlife, it was set in some liminal space, and it was all just about the ghosts. So the ghosts were the narrators, which they never usually are. The ghosts are the narrators, they're the main characters. It's all set in wherever this sort of space is after they physically die. And it is continuing on. There's no religious narrative. There's no God. There's no judgment. There's no reward. There's no retribution. There's no nothing. They're just plonked somewhere else, dealing with the sort of hyper reality where everything is pretty much a hyper real version of themselves and everything they experienced. And now they're working through stuff in the afterlife. So I thought, well, this is kind of interesting because this is not the normal thing. So I got very interested in why is that happening? Why have they done this? And so I think when I was researching, and a lot of the scholarship I read was kind of written by people who don't believe in mediumship or the afterlife or the continuation of consciousness. So it was sort of a lot of the scholarship was reading it from the vantage point of the human. Whereas I was sort of reading it from the vantage point of, well, the ghost is real. Mm-hmm. Now let's just take the ghost as seriously as real. And now what's going on? Now what's the discussion? Do you see? You know what I mean? So it's a bit approach to it. People are like, why are you talking about that? Because the ghost is real.
Okay, so let's distill this down and talk to us about mediumship and grief then, because we're taking this transformative take on spirituality and consciousness with what you're talking about, and how does that distill down into mediumship and grief? And also there's a shift that's going on from traditional religion towards non-traditional spirituality. So I think a little bit, some of that's all connected, would you say?
Yeah. Well, I definitely did look at the sort of new religious movements, the spiritual but not religious movement, and these sort of shifts in spirituality, in our belief systems. When I was trying to answer this question, why is this now new approach happening, or this approach happening? So I did look into that quite a bit. It was kind of interesting because there's this idea, there's been this idea, oh, religion is dead. You know, the Enlightenment killed religion, materialism, the 20th century religion is dead. We've become scientifically minded. You know, everything has to be rational, whatever. But the statistics actually don't bear that out. You know, there's more fundamentalist religion now than, you know, there was. So a big move towards fundamentalist religions. But there is also a distinct rise in what's called the spiritual but not religious, which is people who have found that the sort of secular paradigm we had, the sort of materialist paradigm, wasn't enough. You know, that it didn't answer the fundamental questions that religion answered, which is what is purpose, what is meaning, what is good, what is the existential questions of like, why are we even here, right? So the secular materialism paradigms, they can answer those, and that's become quite apparent as we moved into the late 20th century, into the 21st century. Even actually, honestly, from the 60s, it started to arise. What we've seen in the statistics is that more and more there's a marked increase. While there's still an increase of people, religious adherence generally, there is actually a marked increase in people now saying that they are spiritual but not religious. In other words, they don't subscribe to any organized religion. And so it becomes this sort of very curated sort of religious thing where people sort of take what works for them. Which, you know, there's an upside and a downside to that as well. But generally what it is it's people finding, you know, like aspects of Buddhism that work, or aspects of this or aspects of that, or the aspects of meditation that work, and just sort of taking that into a very sort of personal form of spirituality, where it's finding that sense of meaning and purpose and compassion and connection and all of these things that religion kind of gave us with all of the doctrine, right? So now it's like it's regaining these things because we've realized secularism is missing something, and it's the missing something that people have started searching for, which has led people into the spiritual but not religious.
I know a lot of people who call themselves spiritual but not religious, and many of them do lean towards studying Buddhism.
It's not actually Buddhism as practiced in the East. It's sort of like an Americanization.
Like the principles.
Yeah, it's like an Americanization of Buddhism. It's elements of Buddhism.
Right. It's fascinating to me.
It's not, you know, this is the thing about the curated spirituality. It's just sort of, you know, cherry picking.
It's exactly what it is. Just exactly what you're saying. And I'm finding that, you know, with a lot of people who I know, and they define themselves that way. I want to ask you another thing, because you talk about the healing power stories in your dissertation. How would you say exploring this more contemporary research into consciousness helps to illuminate the vital role of healing in grief and trauma recovery? And I have a second part to that question. How does embracing the spiritual and mysterious dimensions of life that you've researched help us find meaning in our lives?
So I think it's important. I think when we start, as we mentioned already, when we talk about consciousness, it's important to understand that we're all connected. So, you know, people have this notion that if somebody has died, they've gone on, you need somebody with a power greater than yourself to go communicate with them. Now, the only difference between the average person who's bereaved and a medium is that the medium can kind of do that on demand for complete strangers. But everybody is capable of maintaining that relationship if they just learn the language of the spirit, right? So what happens is that there's a lot of, you know, sort of misnomers. There's a lot, you see this on Facebook, you see this on Facebook pages, a lot of people sort of passing around superstition and opinions, which aren't, you know, opinions are just opinions. They're not actually facts, right? And so, but there is actually a way of developing that language. And I always say to people, that language is going to be unique to you and your loved one, the same way as your interaction here was unique to the two of you. It's going to have its own unique nuances in the spirit world as well. So, like with my partner, somebody, as I said, and they're going to, maybe they'll stop. So, you know, as I said in the book, my partner came and it was sort of trying to get my attention in ways that had him written all over them. You know, and I talk about this in the book. So people say, oh, if you got a robin, it's your dad. And if you got this, it's this, and it's this. And then people get very confused. And then they're going, was that a sign? Was not a sign? Well, there is actually a way of working with that, you know, because you will see the mark of your loved one on them. And this is something that I always ask people, it's a language you have to learn. Enjoy it. You know, people approach like, oh, it's some destination I've got to get to. You know, it's like, no, it's your loved one is now in a different form within the stream of consciousness. So now you just have to learn a different way of communicating. You know, there's just a different, and there are ways to do that.
And you teach that I'll
I
bet you
do.
teach that to people.
Yeah, I do. We'll talk about that later. But it's, for me, it's like, you need to trust them. You need to trust your connection. That's the more important thing. That's more important than anything any medium says. And I ask people just to enjoy that. It's like, it's a new exciting phase of your relationship. It's like, okay, in all of the grief, which can be very debilitating, there is this potential for this whole new phase of your relationship. So it becomes not seeing it as a loss. There's the physical loss, but it's not seeing it as a loss. It becomes, how can this now be just this whole new chapter in our relationship? And how can I enjoy talking to my loved one, noticing when they're talking back? I mean, it can be a very exciting time, actually. And I'm not belittling people's grief. As you know, I've been here myself.
Of course. And so have I. I mean, you and I, we both experienced it, but we each have our own unique relationship with our partners who have transitioned.
Absolutely. But I think it's important to find some joy and find some excitement in that. So my partner's now in spirit form. Let's start finding ways to communicate with each other and experiment with that and explore that and enjoy that and know that you're in it together, because there's nothing better than when like I remember one time, for example, waking up in the morning, the number 337 was in my head. And I was like, what on earth is that for? I had no idea. And I'm thinking, that doesn't make sense for him because he wouldn't be into numeral or anything like that. And later that day, I was in my car with a friend of mine and we were driving down, I think we're on the Upper West Side somewhere, and an ambulance, we were near where he had died actually, and an ambulance went by and a bunch of cars were not stopping. And I remember saying, Derek, for God's sake, why won't these cars pull over? There's somebody in this ambulance that's dying. And all I could think of was like that day when he was in the ambulance. But we pulled over and I got very upset, but we had pulled over, and when the ambulance went by, I shifted to move, and I noticed that there was a yellow cab in front of me, and the number on the cab was 337. And these are the things I say to people, like, be open to this, because that is meaningful. The number 337 in itself means nothing. But what really was meaningful was the knowledge that I was upset. He knew already the morning, this is amazing to me, he knew that morning, the afternoon, I was going to be, I'm not going to go into premonitions, but the afternoon, he somehow could see that in the afternoon I would be pulled over behind a cab with 337 on. At the same moment, I was very upset about just being brought back into that moment. And he showed me this number to show me, I'm here.
I'm here with you. I'm here with you.
And there's so much of this amazing stuff goes on that I really do try to say to people, don't get off Facebook, get away from all of that. Spend the time with your loved one. Learn this language between you. It's going to be different from somebody else's language. So you can't just go buy a book and see a list of, here's check. Because, if you see a penny, it's your loved one. Which loved one? Right?
Right, because that may not be how they would communicate. I'll tell you a very funny, one of my favorite stories, Karen. And then I want to ask you, because I know you have a wonderful promo for our audience today. But my husband was a funny guy, and he loved to laugh, and he loved to kind of bust me in different ways. So the first guy I was dating after he transitioned 3 or 4 years later was from England. And the guy was coming to New Jersey. And as he came through my door, he said, he was calling me Reenie. He said, Reenie, I don't know what took me over, but when I got to the duty-free shop, I have never seen it before, but I was attracted to this one particular cologne, and something said to me, I had to buy it to wear with you. And of course, it was my husband's cologne. And I said to him, you buster, you. But that would be exactly the way for Saul to tell me, honey, I know what you're doing. It's okay. I'm here. And he would have gotten a big kick out of it because he knew that I would have known that was a small signal.
Well, you can see how exciting it can be when you just turn your focus to you and your loved one and away from the lists and Googling and Facebook and all the other nonsense that's out there, and really just turn. I always say, trust your loved one more than any medium, because also everybody's got multiple loved ones in the afterlife. So who sent the robin? Who sent the penny? Whatever, But there is a way of working with this. And I think that I always encourage people, because grief is just grinding. I mean, it's just so hard. And one thing I want to say about grief actually is a lot of people have come to me with this and they say, oh, somebody told me because I'm grieving, I'm blocking my loved one. And then what that does is then people think, oh, then they start feeling bad and like they're not feeling bad enough already. Now somebody's making them feel worse because they're blaming them for not being able to see signs or recognize their loved one because they're grieving. And it's such nonsense. Grief is love. That there's no such thing as block. The only thing that blocks your loved one from you is ignorance. It's a lack of education. Absolutely nothing else, And so the thing is that my mother died, and this people say, oh, and then there's the other thing. Oh, you've got to leave them alone for X amount of months.
Oh, yeah, that's not true either. I know.
Why would that be? Don't you think that immediately is the time they really want to connect with you to say, I'm okay?
I'm here. Of
course, immediately. My mother, in Ireland, we have these big 3-day wakes, and we have we lay the body out in the front room of the house so that it doesn't go to mortuary. So when my mother died, my dad and I picked out a wardrobe, but then they brought her back to the house in the coffin in the front room. So this is the way you did it in Ireland. And then you have everybody around the house. So everybody comes to the house, and you have our house was bursting at the seams with all the people who came from my mother, and the priest did 5 decades of the rosaries, and everybody up and down the stairs and out bursting out into the gardens, and everything stayed for 5 decades of the rosaries. But I knew that something like this would happen. So when they brought my mother back in the coffin to put her in the front room, she just died the day before. Here she is. They brought her in, they took the lid off. I thought, oh my God, she's going to go mad, because her hair was tossed. Her skin looked terrible. She was and I thought, she's going to go absolutely mad when all these people come around. And so I went up and I got her curling iron. I plugged it in. I got her makeup bag, and I was there curling her hair in the coffin and doing her makeup in the coffin and everything to make. And she looked lovely by the time I was finished. Like, she looked like herself. And so, of course, Ireland, people coming around, the neighbours, like, oh, isn't she a lovely corpse? This is them, So after the 100 and something people all left the house and it was quiet again that night, I went up to bed, and my room is above where my mother was. And I just was getting into bed. I got into bed and I said to my mother, Mom, how do you feel? And she showed me a crown. Like a queen.
Oh, wow. Yeah. That's beautiful.
She was in her coffin downstairs, and people say, leave them alone. Do you think that was the most important thing for my mother to say, was like, thank you for doing all of that? So that's nonsense. And so I think that we really need to, as we were talking earlier about consciousness, it's really time to take all of this into the 21st century, into an understanding of what's going on within the non-religious but spiritual context, within the context of contemporary consciousness studies and what we're discovering about that, to understand that all of this other medieval, classical, early Christian church stuff, and even earlier, doesn't make any sense. We interpret what we know at a given period of time through the frame of reference that we have. 500 years from now, we'll think about this differently. But we shouldn't today be thinking about it the way they thought about it 500 years ago.
I could not agree more. I agree. And that's part of why you and I are talking today. That's part of the reason for this conversation. And I know that you have a wonderful promo in mind for our Grief and Rebirth podcast audience. Yes. I think it sounds fantastic. And I know we're going to provide a link for it. Could you tell everyone a little bit about it?
Yeah, so I designed a course called Love Afterlife. And it's basically kind of like from the title in this, Awakening to Love Afterlife. And what it is it's for people who want to maintain their own relationships with their loved ones themselves directly. Right. And so I actually designed it from all of these things that people were coming to me with, all of the superstitions, the heartbreak, all of this other stuff, the confusion, everything that was going on. There was also loads of people coming along and their husband had just died and some medium had told them they had to move on and find somebody else. They were in the depths, the throes of grief, people say. So that I fear for people, to be honest, And so what I did was I created this sort of on-demand, it's a self-paced course. You can buy it out, go back to it, do it over and over again. And what it's designed to do is to talk about these things that we're talking about, to talk about and identify myths and superstitions and dispel them, to talk about how this communication works, and have all these practices in it to help people develop the sensitivity to sort of shift out of what they think should be going on to what is going on.
It's really going on, yeah.
A lot of the time, people are missing the signs or they're missing the presence because they think it's supposed to be this. And I'm saying, forget that. Talk to your partner, talk to your child, talk to your mother, talk to whoever. Work it out with them, And so I created this little course that helps people with practices and with teachings and tips to really understand and find ways themselves to both work with their loved ones, to maintain that connection with their loved ones, to increase their own sensitivity, because sometimes people think they're out there looking for burning bushes. Sometimes it's as simple as you're sitting there, you're feeling distressed, and then all of a sudden a calmness comes over you. And you think, I feel calmer for no particular reason. You feel calmer because somebody has just come and given you a hug to calm you down. And what you didn't realize was they're present. That's them.
Right.
And
right.
So we're looking in the wrong places. And another really common thing is people are just washing the dishes or brushing their teeth, and out of the blue, a memory of a loved one hops into their head, and they think, how interesting is that?
Or a song, right?
Not even the song. This is the memory, because it could be just like, now I've just got this completely disconnected memory about the time we took the dog to the beach. And you've just, for no reason, this memory has popped into your head. And then you think, strangely enough, I just had a completely unconnected memory of walking the dog on the beach. And we think we've just thought about them. What's actually happened is they've thought about us. And we felt their thought touch our mind. And these are the ways our loved ones are communicating with us. We don't need to be in the wild looking for signs out there. It's all happening here. And so these are things I wanted to teach people. This is where to look for the language,
that is particular for you, for your particular loved one.
Absolutely, yeah.
That's how it sounds like. That's how it would work, and it doesn't have to be a partner. It could be a child. It could be a friend. It could be anyone.
Everybody's communicating.
It's lovely.
My mother used to interrupt me. I wouldn't even be thinking about her. I would just be like washing the dishes or something, and I would just see. The thing is that and also the other thing is the other thing I think is important to learn is the meditation practice. Just this helps to still the mind, to become aware of how our own mind moves. Because when we do that, we become more sensitive to when somebody else is actually, because this is all telepathic communication. Like, it's no burning bushes here. This is telepathy. Telepathy is a merging of thought. So when we understand where our thoughts are and how we think and how our mind moves, becomes more apparent when, that thought couldn't have been mine. And a real easy giveaway is that the way the mind works, it works by rumination and association. Our mind only thinks in half-baked thoughts. If you pay attention, if you actually observe the mind, that's why it's an important part of the course as well. If you observe the mind, you realize the mind thinks, unless you're actually talking, the mind doesn't think in full sentences. It thinks in half-baked, sort of half ideas, half images, sort of like dreamlike, half-baked, and ruminates, just sort of rolls from thought to thought by association. So when something interrupts that, it's not you, it has to be somebody else.
Pay attention.
To learn that. You got to learn that, yeah.
That's a wonderful course. That sounds marvelous to me. And what is the special Karen? Frances McCarthy tip for finding joy in life?
Oh, for finding joy. Well, I know that's going to sound a bit cliched, but I really do think that the joy is in the present moment. And that doesn't mean that you can't be remembering joyful things in the present moment. But the joy, I always say regret is in the past and anxiety is in the future, and the only joy is in the moment. But I think the other thing too that we have to remember, and this especially goes when you're bereaved, when you're grieving, when you're in that kind of pain, because there's a real hollowing out in those early days of grief, is that it's okay to find that moment of joy when you're grieving. Your loved one is going to be happy for you that you've done that, So, but it's important to know that they also have the compassion and empathy to know that you're grieving. So they're not saying, oh, cheer up, buck up. They have that compassion and empathy. But if you find a moment of joy, they're going to be joyful for you too. So it's important to remember that. And I think one other thing about that is, I think we actually have to work at that. I think we have to work at being happy. It can get very easy, and not just for the bereaved, for anybody. You just turn on the news and you wake up full of the joys of life, and by noon you just want to kind of crawl back into bed, right? So I would say that happiness and joy takes effort. We have to choose it. Or at least we have to choose. We don't have to choose to be going out sort of filled with exuberance, but we can choose in this moment to find a little tiny kernel of joy in something. It could be the tiniest thing. It can be that, oh, this coffee I just made is really good. Or those flowers are beautiful colors. I love how the colors are making me feel. Or, it can be, I have a house to live in. It can be
totally true.
It can be the tiniest thing. But I think that we have to just choose to find it too. Because the world is overwhelming, and it's easy to get beaten down by it, and it's easy to get beaten down by trauma, and it's easy to get beaten down by suffering. And I just want to clarify, I am not talking about spiritual bypassing.
Well, tell us about that. Go ahead.
Well, trauma and grief are real things that are stored within you, within the nervous system, within the spirit, and they need real help. They either need time and self-compassion and hopefully a supportive community or some supportive people in your life, but you have to allow yourself to grieve. And this is part of the reason why, as we were saying earlier, which is why I'm like, I sometimes fear for people who are grieving, because people are very uncomfortable with grief. They're very uncomfortable with the bereft. They're very uncomfortable with death. How many names do we have for death? Passing, passed on, moved on, gone to spirit. We will say anything rather than say someone died, right? That's just built into us. We have a human aversion to death and dying. And so grieving people mirror that. So after a while, people will get very uncomfortable about that. And people say, oh, you got to go through these phases, which we know is not the way it is. Or it's been a year, you should be back on the horse. Grief is grief. It's going to take you as long as it takes you.
That sort of distills down to, would you get over it because you're making me uncomfortable with your pain.
Absolutely. Or you're miserable. I can't.
Yeah, would you move on already? Because I'm tired of hearing about it, or whatever.
Or I'm tired of you dragging yourself around in your slippers and your rollers and no makeup on, or whatever the case may be. It's important with that to understand that your loved ones love you. Grief is love. Grief is love. If you hadn't loved, you wouldn't be grieving. All right. Your loved ones understand that. You need to understand that. I think it's very, very important to have self-compassion and patience with yourself. Now, we don't want to be in 2 years from now still in our rollers and our slippers. There comes a point in time where we have to make those little tiny finding those little incremental moments of joy. But grief is grief. We need to be allowed to grieve, not try to swallow that or bypass that for other people's comfort, I would say anybody who's really struggling with grief, and I have to say this, Irene, mediumship is not a substitute for grief, for grief counseling. It's just no way.
No.
If you're struggling, you need to find a grief group or support group or a counselor or somebody to help you A medium is not trained and shouldn't. If you go to a medium for mediumship, they should not be counseling you. That is not the hat you booked them for. Knowing your loved one survived can really, when the penny drops on that, sometimes you get a session where something just comes up, and it can be the most inconsequential thing where the penny just dropped for the client. Oh, that's them. That's marvelous. But they are still going to be grieving. It certainly takes the edge off it, and certainly the continuing to develop the relationship and finding joy and excitement in that is marvelous. But you still have to grieve the physical loss. So that's
and not only that, but like if you have other issues that have been unhealed earlier on in your life, and now you're grieving. For instance, if you were abandoned or something, and now your loved one has transitioned, that's going to raise your grief level way past a 10. I mean, you're going to, and that I tell people all the time, if your grief is that intense and deep for quite a while, that's your indication. Go get some healing.
Professional help.
Yeah. Go get professional help.
Yeah. Yeah. And like you say, everybody's different. Everybody's traumas are different. Everyone's triggers are different. Everyone's relationship was different. Everybody's support that they have around them is still different, and you can't, it's all different, but it's also non-comparable. You cannot compare one person's. I remember somebody saying to me that their grief was deeper than my grief over the loss of my partner, because they had been married 20 years and we hadn't, so their grief was greater. And I'm like, that makes no sense. It's non-comparable, because I have the added grief of the loss of those 20 years, and so everybody's grief is apples and oranges. So really, I think people, self-care and self-compassion is the most important thing,
Yeah.
I think the other thing with grief, and I think we kind of touched on this earlier when we were talking about like these ideas of suffering and consciousness and stuff, is that sometimes, grief brings with us such intense suffering that can actually have a profound positive, ultimately, effect. Because when we understand suffering, not for everybody, but a lot, many people find that the deeper their sense of suffering, the more compassionate they are to other people's suffering, and the more they feel a need to contribute to the well-being of others. And so I think that sometimes suffering can lead us to an understanding and a way of finding meaning in service.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. That really resonates with me. Karen, your ability to harness this transformative power of mediumship to bring healing, comfort, and inspiration during life's most challenging moments, and from all that you're doing, it's truly extraordinary. I really think you're amazing. Yeah,
it's a challenging world. I mean, to go back to what we were talking about earlier about the sort of the skepticism and stuff, it's to try to, I'm finding it very kind of challenging to navigate at the moment between, beliefs around mediumship, beliefs around extrasensory perception, beliefs around all of that, which certainly are not given much credence by academia. And then on the other hand, to go to academia where they find all of that so grossly inferior. But also to be trying to take an element of education into this, to try to find this middle way, which is why I love the work. You were asking me about consciousness earlier. So I love the work, and I love listening to people like Rupert Sheldrake and David Chalmers and Dean Radin and so many, Jeff Tarrant, and so many of these people who are really taking the time to give this some serious study and serious consideration, so just dismissing it. It's a very challenging road to walk. I'm finding it myself.
It sounds like it's sort of like a new frontier, in a way. It's something that we've found throughout history, reference to and all, but we kind of have a new, more conscious frontier, I think, going on now.
Yeah, and change, I guess it's change, and change is just not easy. You're sort of buttressed between one institution here and another institution there, and you're trying to do something different that's far more contemporary, trying to sort of evolve and elevate, really just trying to evolve and elevate. I mean, I think that mediumship is only as small as us. The spirit world has infinite capacity. And I feel that if we can open our minds, educate ourselves, inform ourselves to the possibilities, and to being open to experimentation and to be opening to the work that's being done in these other fields, it becomes sort of a critical mass of evolution and elevation to hopefully ultimately bring mediumship into something that is much bigger than it currently is, because the capacity is certainly there in the spirit world, but the capacity is within us, but we have to recognize that.
I can't think of a better closing for this interview than just to leave it at what you just said. Is there anything else you want to add before we bid each other adieu?
No, if you think that's the best.
I think that's beautiful. That is beautiful. It's just a perfect ending. I just want to tell you what a pleasure it is to once again have you on the podcast. And this has been a profoundly enlightening conversation for anyone who is here listening to us. Oh, I think it's beautiful. Thank you again, Karen. And may light continue to shine on your path.
Thank you.
Truly from my heart.
Thank you. And yours too.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to Grief and Rebirth. Remember, you can dive deeper into everything we've discussed by checking out the show notes and all past episodes at ireneweinberg.com. Don't forget to follow us on social media at Irene S. Weinberg on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and wherever you love to hang out online. Plus, we're on YouTube, so be sure to subscribe and never miss a video. For those of you listening, you'll find links to my 2 books, Good to the Last Drop and They Serve Bagels in Heaven, in the show notes. And if you're watching on YouTube, you can see those books listed right above, so don't miss out. And here comes a special treat. If you sign up for Audible as a first-time user using my link, which you can find in the show notes, you can get They Serve Bagels in Heaven for free. And finally, people often ask me what I read, what I use, and what I recommend for healing and self-care. So I've carefully curated a compilation of those items to share with you. You can head over to kit.co/grief and rebirth to check them out. Thanks again for tuning in, and until next time, many blessings.